Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. This webinar is entitled Navigating the Supply Chain Transparency Act. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are situated on traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nation and the Huron-Wendat and the Métis Nation. As ResCon's office is located in Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. So just a few housekeeping items before I begin. Specifically, there's going to be a question and answer section. We actually left quite a bit of time for that today. And so think of your questions. Please use the question and answer chat feature. And then we'll ask and we'll make sure that your questions are asked. As always, this webinar will be recorded. The idea there is, it's great that people can join us today, but some people can't. And so everyone who registered will get a copy of that. The purpose of this webinar is awareness and compliance. And so Bill S-211, which some people are calling the Modern Slavery Act, it largely slipped under the radar in our sector in construction. And that's for two main reasons. So one, it's federal legislation. And because we're employment-based in our activities, most federal legislation applies to federal workers, and we're provincially regulated. And so I think, people can be forgiven if they didn't see this because one, federalization tends to not apply to us. This does. And then the second, some of the concepts and definition of who is covered, it's fairly broad and fairly vague. So it's actually a little bit tricky to understand who's going to be caught by this. And so when we look at our member services, our goal is to make sure that our members have up-to-date information to stay in compliance. And so that's really what we're here today. And so we're very thankful to have Carl and James from Filion-Wakely come. I'm going to do a quick speaker introduction, and then we'll turn it over to them for the presentation. And so Carl Peterson is a partner at Filion-Wakely. He's worked in all areas of labor law with special expertise in construction. He also has special expertise in R3 collective agreements. He's been part of the bargaining process, I want to say, for over 25 years. And when a member calls me and asks a question and I say, I don't know, I need to check on that, Carl's the person that I actually call. And so Carl, on our side, has written most of the collective agreements we have. So we use them for all of our grievances. We use them for bargaining. There's nobody that knows our collective agreements better than Carl. And joining him is James Jennings, and he's a senior associate. And James also practices in all areas of labor of employment law with a focus on labor relations, occupational health and safety, and workplace compensation. He's got experience in both the union and non-union sector and works in pretty much all sectors, including manufacturing, construction, and hospitality. And we're going to sit back and we're going to hear their presentation. And then please, if you do have questions, use the question and answer feature. Thank you very much. And turn it over to Carl and James.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. So we are going to, in terms of the format of the presentation today, I'm going to start off by describing where this legislation came from, what it involves, what obligations, if any, it triggers for our audience today. And then I'm going to turn it over to James for the details of your reporting obligation. So in terms of the overview, we're going to shortly talk about, where did this come from, the global context, the ins and outs of the bill, the transparency reporting requirements, liability enforcement, international compliance, and then a checklist that we've put together. I want to start off by following up on something Andrew just talked about, and that is the vagueness of the legislation. It's going to become pretty evident when you hear this presentation and when you look at the materials that there are a lot of concepts that beg for further definition. That's a problem with a lot of legislation, but it's going to be a huge problem with this. So we're going to do our best to elucidate the various terms and your obligations, etc. But you're going to probably have a lot of questions even after today when things come up, and we'll try to provide that resource down the road. The government has already anticipated the ambiguity of it, and they have indicated that they are looking at this first year as a trial run, which they will probably fine tune. So let's go to the next slide. Modern slavery, as we're calling it, has been around for a while. Obviously, the slavery that we all know about in terms of the Civil War in the U.S., et cetera, has been outlawed for over 100 years now. But we have various forms of what we call modern slavery, going back to 1930 when Canada joined the Geneva Convention, outlawing modern slavery or forced slavery. And as you can see on the statistics, we've kind of gone from this not being on the radar to a point now where we've got some global statistics, 50 million people experiencing this type of forced labor. COVID made it worse. We now have a lot of private agents imposing forced labor on individuals throughout the world. And as you probably know, we have hundreds of companies that import goods from countries that may have forced labor within their borders. Next slide gives us an idea of the international context. The reason this piece of legislation came in when it did is because the European community started the ball rolling, following up on the conventions, as you can see, going way back to 1930 and 1957. You then have the International Labor Organization's Modern Slavery Convention that came out in 2022. And the European Economic Community saw that there was a problem from an international perspective. They started passing legislation following up on the International Labor Organization's guidelines. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see that there are a number of companies throughout the world that have adopted legislation similar, if not identical, to what Canada has. That's where all this has come from. Next slide. So there were two approaches the government could have adopted. You'll see a lot of legislation or local health and safety legislation that actually puts direct liability on companies to ensure that your health and safety obligations are followed. But what the federal government did here is they followed the transparency approach rather than the due diligence or direct liability approach, which is thankful in that we're still early in the makings of this legislation and trying to work out how it's going to work. So the good news is that they've adopted the transparency approach, which means that we are focusing on the disclosure and reporting of information rather than putting an onus and an obligation on everyone in this audience to actually go out and find child labor and put an end to it. And so we're really going to be talking about in this legislation your reporting and disclosure obligation. And those are found in Bill S-211, which is over. We've got an overview on the next slide. So, as I said before, the purpose of this is to hold companies accountable for forced labor or child labor in supply chains through transparency measures. Now, let me just stop there for a second. A lot of people, I think, are focusing on child labor, where you read a lot of stories from Southeast Asia, whether it's Vietnam or China or Pakistan or India, where there are a lot of reports of children being employed in manufacturing facilities, ages of 12, 13, 14. That is a focus of this legislation, but it's not the only one. It also includes forced labor, so anyone over 18 who's not considered a child is covered by this legislation. Um, and so it's important to keep that in mind, that when you are doing the reporting obligation and the focus of this legislation, that we keep in mind that we're talking about forced labor and child labor, which are defined in the Act on the next slide. So one of the hallmarks of this legislation is the broad definitions. And so when you see child labor, it's defined as anyone that's providing labor by people under 18 who are mentally, physically, or socially in a dangerous situation where the labor is interfering with their schooling or depriving them of schooling. And so, very broad definition. And a lot of people under 18 in various third world countries would meet that definition quite handily. The next definition in the next slide is forced labor. Again, very broad definition. Labor or service provided by any person under circumstance that could reasonably be expected to cause that person to believe their safety or that of a person known to them would be threatened if they failed to provide labor. On a side note, President Biden recently adopted an executive order making it a presumption that, as you probably read in the news, there is a group in Western China called the Uyghurs, or a Muslim minority in Western China, who have been put in education camps, et cetera, and oppressed by all the news accounts. The Americans have passed a law making a presumption that any goods coming out of that area produced by the Uyghur community are going to be presumed to be forced labor, and therefore covered by this act. Canada has not adopted a presumption similar to the Americans, but that's a great example of what the Americans and other nations throughout the world consider to be forced labor, in that they are in communities where they're being forced to manufacture goods for a very cheap price in conditions where they can expect to be either oppressed or forced into doing the labor and having threats either to themselves or to the family if they don't provide the service. So the key part of the legislation, however, considered out in the next slide, is to, who does this cover? And this is probably the most important. The next two slides are the most important things that you're going to be considering in your business while you're on this presentation. First is government institutions. We don't have to worry about them, but the government has made it clear that the federal government is obliged to follow these reporting obligations. Private industry, you're going to be covered by either if you are on the stock exchange, or you're doing business or having assets of two of the following three items. You have at least 20 million in assets, or generated at least 40 million in revenue, or employing an average of at least 250 employees. So first thing to mention is that no matter how small or how big you are, if you're on the stock exchange, you have a reporting obligation over and out. If you're not on a stock exchange, then you have to come within the definition of 20 million assets, 40 million revenue, or 250 people employed on average. The important point to note here is, and we're making this clear to our international clients, we happen to be part of a larger group called L&E Global, where we have over 30 labor law boutiques throughout the world, Germany, France, Australia, etc. And we liaison with our affiliates in these other jurisdictions. And this is probably the most important thing that's come to mind in talking to our clients around the world. So you could have a company here in Canada that's only got 20 employees and maybe 1 million in assets, but they are connected to a company in the US that has 100 million in assets and 50 million in revenue and 500 employees. And so it's important to realize that when you're looking at the assets, the revenue, and the employee threshold, that we're talking globally, Canada and all other jurisdictions. So an employee is defined in the Act is full-time, part-time, or temporarily in Canada or in any other jurisdiction. Very important to keep that in mind. And so the next slide. So in calculating assets and revenues, the government's going to be looking at the consolidated financial statements. The assets and revenue values are in Canadian dollars. You do not include the assets or revenues of a controlling entity, the parent. Thresholds relate to the total global assets, as I've just indicated. And the assets are calculated on a gross basis, not a net basis. The next slide talks about who. So before we get to this, let's just summarize whether or not your entity is covered. So as you can see, it doesn't take very much when you're only talking about two of the three. So if your assets and revenue, doesn't matter if you only got 20 employees. If you've got over 250, you can still come within that definition if you've got the revenue number. So it's very important to note that a lot of companies are going to come within this definition as to whether or not the entity has reporting. So what does it cover? It's important to note, as I said at the beginning, the transparency obligation is really a reporting. And James will get into what does reporting mean. But to trigger the reporting requirement, you have to deal with one of these three things. It talks about if the producing, selling, or distributing goods in Canada or elsewhere. Now, some of you might be into that category in terms of perhaps distributing, but most companies in Canada are going to have a reporting obligation and be worried about this legislation in terms of their role in importing into Canada goods that are produced outside of Canada. So, for example, you're buying drywall in China, is it coming from the Uyghur community, for example? Is it being produced by forced labor or child labor? So, or you control an entity engaging in activity. And so control is defined as including direct and indirect control, and is to be applied broadly. This is right here, importing and control are two of the more general, vague definitions that we're going to have to worry about for the first year of this legislation being in play. And as you can probably imagine, if you're importing, pretty easy to import almost anything from across the globe days. And if you are controlling an entity that's importing, so for example, you can't say, oh, I don't have a reporting obligation because we used one subsidiary of our company to import. So if you control the entity that's actually doing the importing, you're actually doing the importing. So let's see if we can figure out what they mean by production, importing, selling, distributing. So in the next slide, we've attempted to further define what we think these terms are going to be dealt with when your reporting obligation kicks in. So production of goods is fairly straightforward. Manufacturing, growing, extracting, processing. Importing, and this is important. Importing goods means accounting for goods under the Customs Act. So in a very layman's way of looking at it, if you deal with a company out of China and say, okay, we want $5 million worth of drywall, for example. You are actually importing those goods, doing a bill of sale with a company in China, et cetera, et cetera. You would meet that definition. However, the importing obligation does not include purchasing goods produced outside of Canada from a third party who is considered to be the importer under the customs. So, as I said, there are a lot of terms on this legislation that lead you down a rabbit hole in terms of what does the Customs Act say? Are you an importer? Are you hiring it, getting it from a third party? Therefore, you're not importing it. They are. That's one of the things that we're probably going to be dealing with in the next couple of months, and is another vague term and scenario that we're going to have to worry about. Selling, distributing, importing, not explicitly defined, meant to be broad. It's going to capture things as marketing, administrative services, software services. But again, selling, distributing are very broad terms. So for example, does it mean you buy something from an importer that's excluded under the Customs Act, but then you distribute it? Is that going to trigger your reporting obligation? And goods subject to trade and commerce. I mean, I think the goods part is easy, given this type of material that you'll be buying from overseas. So basically, just to summarize this bit in terms of the act, and I turn it over to James to talk about the actual reporting obligation. The federal government are following the cue from the international community. This is now a global issue being dealt with globally by a lot of the European countries, including Australia, and importantly, California. So the American government has not passed this legislation federally, but the state of California has adopted this legislation. And so if you've got a subsidiary in California, then that subsidiary will be covered by state legislation that will be very similar to this. Obviously, as Andrew said, we're going to leave some time for questions as a result of definitions, whether your obligation is triggered, whether you're covered by it. And I'll turn it over to James now to deal with the reporting obligation.
Thanks, Carl. So moving on to the report, as Carl said, the first step in the reporting process is, of course, to create the report itself. And so the legislation sets out some technical requirements in terms of what the report needs to look like and in terms of mandatory content. So the maximum size of the report is 10 pages, or if it's bilingual, so you have both a French and English portion to it, then it can be up to 20 pages. Effectively, it's just the 10 pages in English, 10 pages in French. It would be submitted to the government via PDF, and it has to be submitted May 31st of each year for the prior financial year. So take, for example, you have a financial year that corresponds to the calendar year, so January 1st to December 31st. Your May 31st, 2024 report would be covering the period of time from January 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2023. If this comes in mid financial year, if your financial year doesn't follow the particular calendar year, then you are going to be preparing the report based off of your previous full calendar or financial year, whatever date range that happens to be. In terms of the substantive requirements of what the report has to include, there are 7 key pieces of information which are set out here on the slide in front of you. So, it deals with issues around the company structure, your supply chain, what steps you've taken to reduce the risk of forced and child labor in those supply chains. And so from looking at the points, we can gain some insight into what the government wants companies to be doing. So essentially being aware of risks of forced and child labor in the supply chains, train your employees on identifying the risks and having policies in place to essentially try and address those risks. I mean, ultimately, as Carl said, this is a transparency-based legislation. So what you're doing is you are reporting to the government what you are doing or not doing, with the idea that by having to be transparent about what you are and are not doing, it will encourage businesses to do better. And ultimately, this is a first sort of stab at the legislation that the government's put out. So it is, it's conceivable that somewhere down the road, whether or not that's 10, 20, 30 years from now, the government may update the requirements to move more towards a due diligence approach. But at least for now, it is, as Carl said, a transparency-based reporting obligation. And so all the reports have to cover off these particular items. As Carl noted previously, and we're going to get into in a later slide, there are other reporting obligations in other jurisdictions that may actually have some of the same information that needs to be reported on in those jurisdictions as the Canadian report. And so as part of the Canadian report, if you have similar reporting obligations in other jurisdictions, it is expected that you will cover that off and just sort of highlight that fact in the report. So to Carl's point, if you have a US subsidiary that's subject to the California legislation, then that would be something that gets referenced in the report as one of the requirements. So interestingly, and this is sort of designed to reflect the fact that businesses will often have somewhat complicated reporting structures, there is an opportunity to submit a joint report. So a parent company or a company that owns other entities can opt for a joint report that it submits on both its own behalf and the companies that it owns. So for example, if you have a parent company and then two subsidiaries, if the parent is covered by the legislation and the subsidiaries are covered by the legislation, the parent could theoretically submit a single report for all three entities. This is available in some cases, but not all. So if the owner and the subsidiaries are significantly different in terms of their operations, or they have very different sort of due diligence processes in place in terms of, kind of dealing with, what steps are being taken to minimize child labor and forced labor in the supply chains. So for example, let's say that you have a subsidiary that has a detailed policy in place saying we're going to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and the parent company has nothing similar to that and is actually taking a very different approach. That wouldn't be a situation where it makes sense to submit a joint report. So the availability of a joint report is really where a parent and their subsidiaries are fairly similar in nature in terms of their operations and are actually have fairly similar programs and systems in place. So for example, it's possible that if someone owns both a development company and a contracting company, there might be different requirements and different steps needed for those different types of businesses, in which case maybe it wouldn't be okay. Maybe it wouldn't be sufficient in that case to submit a joint report. It's still the first realm of us actually trying to do these sorts of things in terms of the report. So it'll be interesting to see if the government provides any more guidance on this. But really the long and short of it is that joint reports are an option. But if you are going to potentially go down that road of submitting a joint report on behalf of multiple entities, they really should be fairly similar entities in terms of their business, their structure, and what programs and policies are in place for addressing issues around child and forced labor in the supply chains. Once the report is actually prepared, step 2 in the process is getting the actual approval of the completed report by the governing body of the company. really, a governing body in this case is simply whoever has authority to bind the corporation and is responsible for its governance. So it could be a board of directors. If it's a smaller privately held company, it could be the owner. It really just depends on the structure of the company. But ultimately, whoever the ultimate corporate decision-making entity or body of the company is the one that would be responsible for signing the attestation. And in the course of a joint report, you can either have the approval being given by the governing body of each entity that is covered by the report, or the governing body of the entity that controls each entity. So either, if you have a parent and 3 subsidiaries, you could get all 4 to attest to the report, or you could just get the parent co. That really depends on who has ultimate authority over the subsidiaries in that case. In terms of the attestation itself, really it's just a statement that sets out whether the report was approved by the appropriate governing body, as well as a signature by one of the members. And we've included on slide 22 here what the prescribed format of the attestation is. Essentially, it says that you've reviewed the information and confirmed that it's true, and then provide the full name, title, date, as well as a statement that the person signing has the authority to bind the name of the entity. Ultimately, it is fairly simple, but it is specifically prescribed by the legislation. And so this is the language that would need to be included for the purposes of the attestation. Step 3 involves actually submitting the report. So the report itself needs to be submitted to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency, which is the federal government body that has been given overall responsibility for these reports. So it is not a Department of Labor piece of legislation. It is the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency. So it can be submitted online via a government portal on the website. So it's you can see the URL at the bottom of the slide, publicsafety.gc.ca. And then not only does the company need to actually file a copy of the report with the ministry, but the report also needs to be published on your entity's website. So if you have a public website, a copy of the report that you submitted actually needs to be posted there in a location that is available to the public. If you do not have a website, then you obviously don't need to post that on the website, but you do need to make sure that the report is available to anyone who submits a request for it. And if you receive a request for it, you have to provide it. See, so this really is a key piece, this posting on the public website, because the purpose of the act from the government's perspective is to promote transparency both to the government and to the public about what you are doing in terms of your supply chain. So if you don't post the report on your website or make it available, you can actually be subject to penalties under the act. If you are a corporate entity that is incorporated under the Canada Business Corporations Act, so that's the federal legislation for incorporating companies, then if you are covered by the legislation, you are also required to provide a copy of the annual report to all of your shareholders. So that's an extra step specifically for CBCA corporations. If your company was incorporated under BC legislation or Ontario legislation, then that requirement doesn't apply to you. That one only applies to CBCA companies specifically. When you go to actually submit a copy of the report to the ministry, you are going to be prompted on the website to fill out a questionnaire. So the questionnaire is mandatory and actually has it has both mandatory and optional questions. Interestingly, the government's compliance material, which is available online, actually references the fact that the questionnaire deals with a lot of the same information as what needs to be in the report. And so something that you can potentially do is actually take a look at the questionnaire first and sort of use what you would be submitting as part of the questionnaire as kind of a template for the actual report itself. So mostly the questionnaire deals with these same subjects that we discussed earlier. and a lot of the information that's included in the report. It has 18 mandatory questions and a few optional ones that are fairly open-ended rather than multiple choice. It's recommended that you fill out all the answers to the best of your ability because it can help solidify that you've complied with the legislation and are making an effort to be transparent about your supply chain practices, as well as it gives you potentially an opportunity to continue commenting on some of these subjects to the extent that you maybe aren't able to fit all of the necessary content into the formal report itself. So you can also view the questionnaire as another opportunity to provide more information that you perhaps weren't able to fit into the report. The first few questions that are part of the questionnaire are fairly straightforward. You're going to be asked about what if you are submitting it as an entity or a government institution. In all of your cases, it would be as an entity. So then the legal name of your company, when your financial reporting year is, because as I mentioned previously, the report is based on what you did during your previous financial year. Your company's business number, as well as whether you're subject to reporting requirements in any other jurisdictions. As a company, you will also be required to specify the definition of entity that you fall under. So, for example, if you qualify because you're listed on a Canadian stock exchange, or as a result of you having sufficient business presence. So let's say you have, over 250 employees and 40 million in assets and conduct business in Canada. You'll also be asked some questions about what sector that the company operates in. So in the case of everybody here, that would be the construction industry, as well as where you're headquartered. So Ontario, for example. In terms of the 18 substantive questions, we're only outlining some of them here, in part because a lot of them actually have subsidiary questions under them. So if you answer yes to one, further questions pop up under them. Some of these questions relate to the structure of your company and the business activities, and others deal entirely with the substance of the report. It will deal with what steps you've taken to prevent any risks of forced or child labor, what your due diligence processes are for trying to prevent that in your supply chains. Some will be multiple choice, followed up with the open-ended questions. And to the extent that the government questionnaire asks for more information in response to one of those sort of more multiple choice questions, they impose a 1,500 character limit in terms of your response to them. So similar to the government only requiring a 10-page report, they are trying to limit the amount of characters and substantive content you provide in relation to any particular question, just to make sure that it doesn't spiral too far out of control. Again, here are some other questions. So if you taken measures to remediate any forced and/or child labor risks that are found, one of the interesting ones and kind of struck me when I was reviewing the legislation originally is actually step 9, which is, has the entity taken remediation measures to address the loss of income to vulnerable families that results from measures taken to eliminate the use of forced and/or child labor? So you could imagine in a world where, you have a large company that, might operate large manufacturing plants overseas that use child labor, and then they take steps to actually phase out the child labor, for example. In a lot of these cultures and countries, the children who are performing the labor are key financial contributors to the economic health of their family. And so by removing the child labor from the supply chain, it can potentially result in families sort of being left in a financial lurch as a result of the child no longer being able to work. And so under 9, it actually is talking about, have you as a company done anything to address the negative impact of phasing out child labor from the supply chain might have on those families, which I it wasn't ever an issue that I had ever really thought of, but I thought it was a fairly interesting one. But again, this is more of a transparency thing, so this isn't requiring you actually do anything about it to the extent that that is a problem. But it is something that needs to be addressed as part of the questionnaire. In terms of liability and enforcement, um, anyone who's not in compliance with the act can be found guilty of a summary of offense and liable for a fine of up to $250,000. So as far as penalties go, it's not the highest. So a prosecution under the OSHA, for example, is significantly higher than that. But $250,000 is nothing to balk at either. It should be noted that the legislation does not directly penalize the existence of forced labor or child labor in a company's supply chains, but other laws might apply that would do so. So, for example, the government can impose a public investigation into those sorts of allegations. You can be found liable and subject to the fine under the legislation if you fail to comply with the reporting requirements, if you fail to report to the minister on time, as well as if you fail to make the report available to the public. So again, although it might be inconvenient and not something that you ultimately want to share with the public, that requirement to post it on your website is important, because if you fail to post it, you can be fined significantly under the legislation. Notably, directors, officers, and any other persons related to an entity who make a false statement in the report or fail to submit the report to the minister can also be personally held liable. So not only the entity, but officers and directors of a corporation can also be liable. The act empowers the minister to appoint what are called designated persons to administer and enforce the provisions of the legislation and confers upon them pretty broad powers to enter workplaces, examine documents, examine computer systems, make copies. Really, these are effectively the same things that a Ministry of Labor inspector has the power to do under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in terms of enter the workplace, look at documents, ensure compliance, and if you fail to comply with their lawful directions and fail to provide reasonable assistance, that in and of itself could theoretically form the basis of a charge under the legislation. In terms of the possibilities of a due diligence defense, for those of you who are familiar with occupational health and safety legislation, as prosecutorial legislation, there's an opportunity and a legal defense to charges under the Act if the corporation is found to have engaged in sufficient due diligence to avoid a violation of the Act. So in this case, again, the requirements of the Act is the actual reporting obligation. So the due diligence defense would be in terms of whether or not you were sufficiently diligent with respect to the reporting obligation itself. So let's say that you spoke with a supply chain provider, made every reasonable effort to ensure that they were not using forced or child labor in their production processes. Maybe you made them fill out a survey, sign a letter confirming that they weren't engaging in any improper practices, and then you report to the effect in your report that there is no improper labor in your supply chain, and it later turns out that that was incorrect. You know, if the supplier knowingly withheld the information that you clearly asked for, and you took steps to verify that it was correct and it turned out not to be, that might form the basis of a due diligence defense under the Act because you took all reasonable efforts to ensure that it wasn't an issue. Similarly, there's another defense under the due diligence headings of the reasonable, honest but mistaken belief. Similarly, it's if you honestly believed something was true but found out later that it was not to no fault of your own, that can also form a potential defense under the Act if it turns out that you're misled about anything under the legislation. Recognizing that we're sort of at the 45-minute mark, we want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So I'm not going to get into the other slides, but I do want to just briefly highlight that not only is there the new reporting requirement, but the legislation passed by the government has also amended the Customs Tariff Act to actually allow border services to effectively render invalid the importation of certain goods that they believe to have been involved in forced labor. And then the importer would then be required to challenge that determination. So that's another piece that's worth noting, is that it is possible now that if insufficient steps are taken to ensure, a child and forced labor free supply chain, it is possible that customs will flag and actually stop the importation of the goods itself. And so that's important to keep in mind, as well as there is actually a government entity known as the Canada Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, which is a human rights ombudsperson intended to review complaints about human rights abuses from Canadian companies. This has really been made to work within the context of garment, mining, and oil and gas sectors, but it is possible that now that the government is moving into supply chain issues more broadly, that the government may also end up expanding the scope of that group to cover off the sort of broader sectors of the economy dealing with forced and child labor. And then just quickly, again, Carl noted that there's international compliance issues. So the UK, Australia, US, and various European countries all have their own equivalent legislation. And more details on those specific pieces of legislation can be found in the slides itself. So just briefly, by way of a checklist, determine the scope of your audit, make sure that are you covered by the legislation or not. In terms of if you are covered, assess the risks in your supply chain by country and by business partner, because the risks of forced and child labor will vary by country and industry by industry. Audit your supply chains, identify a reporting mechanism, make sure that you implement any necessary policies and procedures. And it would also be worthwhile in terms of dealing with any kind of contractual relations with your foreign vendors to actually impose requirements in the contract itself that no work be performed using forced or child labor. And now time for questions.
Perfect. Thank you both for that wonderful presentation. We're going to move quickly into the questions. So the first one from the audience, we have, are there any trustworthy checks and balances that can confirm where and how the materials have been produced?
Good question. I think we're still in the infancy of this. And I haven't, I don't know if you have, James, but I haven't seen anything that's been published yet that would give you a guideline. I'm assuming the question is, look, is there a document either produced by a private organization or by the government, which tells us, don't buy from X or this area is suspect. Other than the American example that I highlighted at the beginning, and what we know of from reporting, I don't think there's a government published document that tells us where you should be looking and where you should be focused. Not yet, anyway. I anticipate that based on this legislation and them collating the evidence they're gathering from all this, that they will follow up with something more substantive to put us on notice as to what we should be doing.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any particular sort of verification source either. I mean, to the extent that there's active concerns about it, I do think that one way of potentially getting around it is being careful about where specifically in the world you are sourcing products from. Obviously, there are some countries in the world where this is a bigger problem than others. So, for example, if you're ordering products manufactured in Europe or the United States, you're far less likely to result in having, forced or child labor in your supply chains versus others. And as Carl pointed out, there's the US approach to the Uyghurs based in China. And so I think it's fair to say that you want to avoid importing anything that would be manufactured in that area specifically. But I'm not aware of whether or not there's any particular international standard for verifying individual quality of manufacturers in other countries in terms of their work. In terms of who they're employing. I think it would be great if there was, but I'm not familiar with any at this point in time. I think to the extent that this continues to grow and be an issue, I think we will probably start seeing those international standards developing, though.
Thank you both for that answer. The next question we have is real property included in the definition of goods? We buy goods, for example, drywall, on an installed basis, but we only sell homes. Are we selling goods?
Well, I just break that down. So when in the process of building a house, you have to buy through somebody drywall. And so the purchase of that drywall could trigger the importing or the distribution. I don't think you just simply say, hey, we're in the business of building, we've got nothing to do with the supply of the materials. So I think the fact that you're buying materials, those materials may have been produced offshore, would certainly trigger a look to see whether or not we come within the importing function, or whether or not you can put that on the company that's actually you're hiring to buy and install. And so that's why it's called a supply chain. I don't think you can avoid it by just simply saying, hey, we don't do anything, we just build houses. It obviously it does not apply to real estate because real estate's here, but it certainly would apply to all the materials that go into the house.
Yeah, to Carl's point as well, I think it's worth emphasizing that the concept of goods in the legislation isn't defined. It's intentionally broad. And so my takeaway from that is that the government is intending specifically for this legislation to be applied as broadly as possible. And so to the extent that you view a house as a collection of individual goods that have been manufactured and imported and then sold as a home to somebody, there's an argument that the government would want that to be included. Selling land wouldn't count because I don't think it's reasonable to consider land to be a good if it's just selling the raw land. But once you're building houses on it, it's a good question and there isn't a clear answer to it under the legislation. But, I think to the extent that we're still dealing with these gray areas at this point in time, it might be worth erring on the side of reporting if you don't have to, because it would be easier to report and then not get fined versus us later realizing you didn't have to, than originally, having an obligation to report now and then not doing it because you thought that you might be excluded. So, again, good question. It's unclear under the legislation, as Carl said, these concepts aren't well defined in the legislation, but you may want to err on the side of reporting if you otherwise satisfy the requirements.
Thank you. The next question is, as a condo developer who uses subtrades to construct projects, would this fall under manufacturing or selling?
I mean, I think this kind of goes back to the same kind of the last question too, right? Is a constructed building that you're constructing essentially, would that fall within the context of the legislation? whether or not that's selling the condos, which is being constructed, could that be viewed as manufacturing? Maybe. Again, the legislation doesn't really define what the concept of manufacturing is for the most part. And so it is possible, but we don't really have clear answers on it at this point in time based off of, what little guidance the government has actually given us at this point in time.
So the next question is, how will enforcement work and who is responsible and what that will look like?
So it's another good question. I don't know that the government really has the whole system in place yet, but as I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, the government has the ability to impose what is called designated persons. So effectively, they will have their equivalent of an MOL inspector who can run around and try and enforce compliance. Now, I don't know for sure what that's going to end up looking like, but I imagine that government entities will go around to different companies, audit their records, see whether or not they satisfy the requirements and whether or not they submitted a report. To the extent that a government has, or that an entity has submitted a report, I imagine that there will be some back-end checks on the part of the government to actually review the reports that have been submitted to make sure that the substantive requirements of the report have actually been met in terms of what has been submitted. But it is, because the legislation isn't really in effect yet, it's difficult to say just how closely the government is going to be actively enforcing this legislation and going around to individual businesses throughout the country and auditing whether or not they should have submitted a report and didn't. It's not clear at this point in time.
Yeah, I think one thing that they probably will do the low-hanging fruit first, and that would be it's easy to audit the stock exchange, right? So every company that's on the stock exchange has to submit a report to its shareholders if they're a federally incorporated company, or to put it on their website. So they could probably devise an audit pretty easily to canvass everybody on the stock exchange to see if their website has one of these reports in it.
Yeah, to Carl's point, I think it's probably easier for them to target the larger businesses to make sure that they're complying before they move sort of down into the smaller businesses to then try and figure out if they should have submitted or not. If like the Canadian Tires of the world or, large manufacturing, large importers that kind of are all household names, I think they're likely to get looked at before, kind of small mom and pop developers. But, it really depends on how many inspectors the government decides to ultimately hire to enforce the legislation, and it's not clear at this point in time how many of those will be.
So next we have, does the relevant governmental authority answer questions about the interpretation or operation of this new statute?
So the government has actually released some fairly helpful compliance materials about who has to report, what has to be in the report, and it's on the Public Safety Canada website. So you can take a look at their website, and I'll copy the link into the chat for anyone who's particularly interested. Actually, I think that was just to hosts and panelists. 1 second, let me resend this. There we go. That's sent out to everybody. So then that'll be able to provide you at least some information on some of the key aspects of the legislation. But I'm actually not certain whether or not they take active calls to ask about it. I'm not sure about that.
Thank you. Then we have, if I buy products that are imported by a supplier, do I need any documentation from that supplier?
So I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier on one of the slides, which at least under the importing requirements, the requirement to sort of bring you under the act, it's based on whether or not essentially you're the person importing it for the purposes of the customs legislation. And so, you know, if you go and you buy 2x4s at Rona, for example, to sort of, you know, include in a construction project, you know, where Rona sort of got that from, you're not going to have an answer to that question. And ultimately, if Rona brought it in from another country, they would be the one who would have been importing the 2x4s in that case. And so you wouldn't come under the importing aspect. You only really fall under the importing aspect if you are the one ultimately bringing it into the country, in which case you would presumably have at least some documentation already as to where exactly some of these goods that you got came from. And so that is one that's kind of like a nuance to keep in mind, is that if you're buying exclusively from local suppliers, at least in terms of the importing requirement, you wouldn't likely fall under that, even if it was manufactured in a different country, because you were not importing the good.
So I think we have time for one more question. How is the average number of employees determined? In December, we have less than 20, and in the summer, the peak season, we can hit 250 employees for about a 4-week period of time.
So the legislation is, and I can quote directly from it, is very broad. It just simply says an average. Doesn't say, you know, weekly, monthly, yearly. So I think to be on the safe side, if you are over 250 at any time in the year, and I think I would take the reporting year, because you're supposed to report on the previous year, or the previous financial year. I think you'd look at the average. And if you go from 300 down to 20, you probably on average being over the 250. And given the broad definition of it, I think you have to err on the side of over the year as opposed to a payroll period.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Ahed now to close us up. And thank you very much for this wonderful question and answer period.
All right, thank you everyone, and thank you Carl and James for joining us. This is still a new and hot topic, so we'll keep monitoring it and let you know of any changes or advancements that happen. So just another reminder, this webinar is recorded. We'll be adding it to our ResCon website and we'll be sharing it in the post-event summary. And last thing, there is going to be a survey that pops up once you log out. Please take the chance to just fill it in to give us some feedback. And if you have any other questions, maybe you can share them with us and hopefully we can get back to you soon. So thanks again and have a wonderful rest of your day.